Welcome back to the Kyle Olson Show. My colleague at Breitbart News, Joel Pollak, has a new ebook out this week titled Neither Free Nor Fair, the 2020 U.S. Presidential Election. He joins me now. So, Joel, if you can boil down the biggest thing that made the election neither free nor fair, what would it be?
Well, the obvious thing that happened was that the rules for the election were changed in the middle. We adopted a completely new voting system for many states called vote by mail. And it was adopted at the urging of Democrats and over the objections of Republicans. So that was by far the major factor. Once you allow large portions of the electorate to simply vote by mail, you're introducing huge levels of uncertainty and, unfortunately, possibilities of fraud. That doesn't mean fraud happened or happened to the extent necessary to change the outcome in the election, but we know from past examples and past warnings by Democrats and Republicans that absentee voting, vote by mail, is the most susceptible to fraud. It's a form of voting that requires additional safeguards. Democrats understood that right up through 2019. In fact, Democrat proposals for vote by mail in Congress specifically indicated that they would include robust signature matching as part of a way to guarantee there wouldn't be fraud. But in 2020, under the influence of Democratic Party lawyers like Mark Elias, the guy behind the Russia dossier, those safeguards were dropped. And so we saw the error rate or rejection rate of absentee ballots go way down, even as the number of absentee ballots or mail-in ballots went way up. You'd expect the opposite. You'd expect the percentages of rejected ballots to go up because many millions of people were doing it for the first time. Instead, we saw the percentages go way down. It is true that Democrats put a lot of energy into voter education, but it's also true that Democratic Party lawyers sued in many states to change the rules and lower the safeguards against fraud. They argued that these safeguards disenfranchised minority voters and were therefore racist. And so to insist that voters be able to prove who they are was considered a form of racism. So broadly, the biggest problem was the introduction of vote by mail at the behest of one party. But there were also other things I talk about in Neither Free Nor Fair that played a significant role. I talk about the problem of political violence, for example, the widespread rioting by the left, which was accompanied by this cancel culture. I mean, I just went to the grocery store yesterday and I noticed that Aunt Jemima had changed its label. You know, they dropped the African-American woman from the label, who apparently was quite a pioneering icon in her own day, the woman who's depicted or was depicted on the label.
Right.
They dropped Uncle Ben and Aunt Jemima and other meaningless, or not meaningless, but harmless icons because of the fear that they were somehow racist. You know, it's ridiculous. So there was this moral panic that was accompanied by the violence, or that accompanied the violence. And that had a huge effect on the election. It became impossible to advocate for Republicans or for President Trump in particular, unless you were particularly courageous. A lot of people felt very intimidated. And there are many, many other things that happened in this election that were biased against the president, biased against Republicans. And it's remarkable that Trump and the Republicans did as well as they did with such a lopsided system.
So how does the Texas case against Michigan and Pennsylvania and the other states address what you're saying here, and specifically the vote by mail issue?
Well, what the Texas lawsuit says is that these four states went outside the state legislatures to make new rules. There were two ways that happened. One is through the courts. So Democratic lawyers brought these lawsuits and they got judgments in some of the courts, or they got these consent decrees, which are like settlement agreements enforced by the courts, where they convinced the state governments to change the laws. That happened in Georgia. There are also cases where Democratic Party officials just made executive decisions to change the rules of voting or drop the rules or not enforce the rules. So they made these decisions on their own that the state legislature had specifically declined to allow. And then there's a second argument, which is that the four states in question did not enforce or apply their voting rules and procedures uniformly across the states. And that gets to the influence of outside private money, Mark Zuckerberg and other sources, people who donated hundreds of millions of dollars to run what amounted to get out the vote operations through local governments in Democrat-heavy counties in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, and so on. And the argument is that denied equal protection to voters in other counties, which were predominantly Republican. And the Gore versus Bush, or Bush versus Gore standard is that you can't have one standard for some counties and another standard for other counties. So they're arguing, Texas is arguing that in addition to the problems of going around the state legislature and changing the rules, these four states also applied the rules unevenly within their own boundaries.
So you take Michigan, for example, and if you have a Wayne County that is doing things a certain way and you have a Kent County that's doing things a different way, and there is not the equal application of the law, whose responsibility is it to ensure that the law is applied fairly and equally? Is it the Secretary of State? Is it the federal government? Whose role is that?
Well, that's a very good question. There's a role for both, really. We have secretaries of state, obviously, in different states, whose role it is to make sure the rules are applied evenly. But we also have some federal role in oversight. It's limited, but it is there in theory. And what we're talking about here is related to the other problem of making up rules as we go. So in Pennsylvania, for example, when the Pennsylvania Supreme Court changed the rules of the election, allowing people to submit ballots even if they were received after Election Day, up to 3 days after Election Day, that was allowed, I think, in Philadelphia. So the Philadelphia officials abided by that new Supreme Court ruling. But I think the Republican authorities in some of the other counties across the state, heavily Republican areas, they said, no, we're just going to go with state law on this. We're not going to obey this Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruling because it seems constitutionally unsound to us. We're just going to be on the safe side and go with the state law. So you had different systems running in different places, partly because of the way that Democrats changed the rules. So that's the problem here. And there really is no recourse other than the federal court system for these problems. Texas is making a valid argument, which is that you're disenfranchising voters around the country if you change your own state's election rules in ways that are unconstitutional. Now, there's probably a limit to where the Supreme Court's going to want to go with that because they don't want to create a precedent where states sue each other after elections. I mean, imagine if after 2016, California had sued Wisconsin, or something like that. I mean, you can imagine the bad incentives it creates if you say, we're going to have a vote and then we're going to let the states controlled by each party fight it out in court as to whether the vote was valid or not. So that's the risk in what Texas is doing. But Texas is raising a valid objection, which is we are all supposed to abide by the U.S. Constitution. These states didn't, and therefore the decision has to go back to the state legislatures, which are the place where these decisions are made under the Constitution.
So is that your prediction that this will ultimately be kicked back to the states and then the state legislatures will determine the electors?
I just think the Supreme Court, my prediction would be the Supreme Court will do that in at most one or two cases. I think, for example, in Georgia, the Supreme Court has a very good reason to send it back to the legislature because in that case, the state legislature did pass a law about ballot signatures in 2019, lowering the standards a little bit. And it was a bipartisan compromise after a very divisive 2018 campaign. So the two parties came together. They both agreed to change the rules in 2019. But then Democrats weren't satisfied with that, and they sued, and they pushed these other changes through a consent decree. And I think the court's going to look at something like that and say, wait, you can't do that. You can't go around the state legislatures, especially when the state legislature has shown you it's willing to act, it has acted. You can't just circumvent the state legislatures. We don't want that happening in federal elections that affect everybody. At the same time, I don't think they're necessarily going to go, for example, to Wisconsin. I'm just picking one example of a rule change in Wisconsin, but they're not going to say, hey, Wisconsin, you made a mistake because you allowed people to apply for absentee ballots without ID by claiming they were indefinitely confined. They're not indefinitely confined. Very few of those voters, I think there were like 100,000 of them, are actually indefinitely confined. It's just that the Secretary of State in Wisconsin or the state officials, county officials, whoever, allowed people to apply under that status. We don't like that. I don't think the court's going to actually do that. I think they're going to give broader discretion to state officials when they're making judgment calls in a pinch. I don't think the Supreme Court wants to question what might be good faith judgment calls by local officials when there isn't time necessarily to revisit a law or whatever. But I think where you can clearly show that there was a bipartisan effort in some of these states to make new laws that addressed some of the problems that Democrats later sued about. I think where the state legislatures could have acted, I think the court's going to say you really should have gone to the state legislature and not tried this end around, going around the legislatures, going around the voters.
Interesting. So where can listeners find Neither Free Nor Fair?
It's available exclusively right now on Amazon for Kindle, and you can read it if you have a computer. You don't need a Kindle device, but it's an ebook. It's doing very well. It's #1 in both of its categories. So I encourage you to read it. People are really enjoying it. Neither Free Nor Fair is the name of the book.
Neither Free Nor Fair, the 2020 U.S. presidential election. Joel Pollak, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
This is the Olson Show. We'll be right back.